we're going to be talking about Chapter 9, Reactivity, and Chapters 9 and 10 are relatively short, but I'm still going to do them as separate files. But just wanted to let you know, hopefully they'll be relatively short because they contain a lot of duplicate, some stuff that we've already talked about in different ways, and then 10 is sort of just a summary of all the different methods of measurement that we've talked about. So I'm not going to duplicate that information, but there is some material in the chapter that I do want to touch on. Okay. Chapter 9, Reactivity. What reactivity is, a measure is reactive if it causes a change in the target being measured, in the behavior being measured. So in doing your behavior observation program, you may have noticed that actually if you were recording the number of candy bars eaten a day or number of calories eaten per day, that the act of actually recording it might have caused a change in the number of calories that you consumed a day. And those are the kinds of things that I was hoping would get discussed on the discussion board on D2L. So, also another example that I always use when I talk about reactivity is we talk about reality TV, or what I like to call as unscripted TV, and really there's a reactive element in that. And if you think about it, it's the camera. The camera is what causes a change in people's behavior. People always say, oh, eventually you forget the cameras are there. I'm not so sure that's true. Even if it's initially true, the camera does cause a behavior, a change in the behavior that's being recorded. Problems with reactivity. Reactivity can be a good thing and make it a bad thing. The bad thing about reactivity is it makes it difficult to obtain a valid picture of client change, because you don't know if you have a highly reactive measure, a measure that's subject to reactivity. You can't determine whether the change that you're observing is really due to the effects of an intervention, or if it's due to the reactive effects of the measure. In addition, if you're using reactivity in a positive manner, for example, you're using it for weight loss. For example, if you're using a food log to log the amount of calories or what you're eating, it makes it difficult to determine if the observed change will persist when not measured. If that's your intervention, what's going to happen when that food log goes away? Are you going through that process, going to change your lifestyle, or is it, if it's just the reactive properties of the food log, then when you take the food log away, then you go back to eating the way you did before. Minimizing reactivity in direct observation. When we talk about direct observation, we talk about a situation where somebody knows that they're being observed, like in a behavioral observation process. They know they're being observed. So that is a situation where reactivity can take place. People know they're being observed, and so that can change people's behavior. The way to some ways the book suggests to minimize that is just a lot of common sense stuff. The observer should avoid interacting should not, ignore, but shouldn't interact a lot with the people that they're observing. If, for example, if I have a classroom of students, if I have somebody in the corner observing for me some behavior of student behavior, then I should explain their presence. So whenever you use an observer, their presence should be explained. They should be positioned appropriately outside of where a lot of the activity's going on, outside of the flow of activity. Their clothing and behavior should not draw attention to themselves. They should just sort of blur into the background be part of the background of the client. You don't want anything that should distract the client. Other things, the observer should follow any rules or norms of the setting. The observer should arrive at the least disruptive time to the setting, and usually that's at the beginning of any, for example, classroom, and the observer should spend time in the setting prior to observing, to getting, anything that they need to get set up any forms, so that, when they start observing, when class begins, that they're not being disruptive. Minimizing reactivity and self-monitoring. You guys did some self-monitoring. It's suggested in the book to self-monitor multiple behaviors, and putting together a measurement package. It's always good to use what we call triangulation, to look at multiple behaviors, and therefore if you're not so focused on looking at just one behavior, you might be able, the reactivity isn't focused on one behavior, and that hopefully might reduce the reactivity then, if you're self-monitoring multiple behaviors. Also recording on an intermittent basis, so that if there is reactivity, you take a break, like you monitor for a week, maybe take a couple weeks off, and then monitor again. So you're recording on an intermittent basis. So that you start and stop again, so you'll have some break in reactivity. And in that way you may be more aware of the reactivity and be able to stop it. Use reality checks from relevant others for overt behavior. So if you're self-monitoring, you may want to get somebody else also to observe your behavior, so you can do some reliability checks. Sorry about that. Some reliability checks to see if there's some consistency between what you're seeing as your behavior and what others are seeing as your behavior. Another way to approach reactivity is to avoid it altogether, and one way to do that is to use what is called unobtrusive measures, and those are that are used without the knowledge of the person being measured. So obviously, if you don't know the measures you're being measured, then there's no chance of reactivity. And we'll talk about 4 different types of unobtrusive or non-reactive measures. They're the same thing. And we'll talk about archival records, behavioral products, and simple observations. Really, physical traces is a type of behavioral products. I'll just touch on that, but that's something I did just want to briefly bring up since the book talks about it. Archival records is the most used probably. It's, hold on, sorry about that. Archival records are records of any type. In school, you can talk about attendance, grades, number of disciplinary reports. You can talk about within a city crime stats, within an agency the number of no-shows, within program evaluation, the percentage of minority participation in the program, average income. So anything, and I give you some other examples there, so anything that can be found in records. So again, since you don't, you can see how these are not subject to reactivity, but there are some problems with them. Sometimes they're difficult to obtain. You have problems because of confidentiality. Also, sometimes they contain systematic biases. If you're looking at on a particular agency program, the agency may record data to make them look more favorable than they actually are, so that they can obtain funding. So you have to question, okay, the accuracy of any data that you're going to look at. You want to understand how it was collected, who it collected, for what purpose it was collected. The data also may be incomplete. On a research project I ran into this. I was looking at some DCS records on foster parents, and we had gotten a form before and thought we were going to be able to collect all this wonderful data on foster parents, but once we got into DCS, what we realized is that about 2/3 of the data was missing. You know, the foster workers didn't use it. It was just part of agency practice not to fill it out, but we didn't know that. So if you're ever going to use records, make sure that you go and look at it, because that really set us back, you know, a few months. We had to come up with another strategy to collect the information from directly from the foster parents. And also, there are cases where you, because the information has been pre-selected, pre-recorded, it's being collected for one purpose, it may lack the information that you need for another purpose. And that was certainly true for our DCS program, and so it was sort of a blessing in disguise when we got to collect the data we wanted to from foster parents. We were able to get the data, all the data that we needed, not just the data that was in the files. Behavior products. All behavior products are the effects or results of behaviors. Examples: number of articles not put away in a child's room, number of safety risks in a home, number of completed school assignments, number of cigarette butts. So, you know, if you go in, if you're doing an intervention with a child and part of that is having them put their toys up every day, then one measure you can use is the number of toys left on the floor. The behavior products are easy to quantify and use, and the observer need not to be present when the behavior occurs. It's limited to counts. It only applies to overt behaviors. Certainly you don't well, don't leave around your feelings and thoughts in a way that you can count them, at least. However, it can be inaccurate. You know, you think about the number of cigarette butts, and even if you mark the cigarette butts, you know, maybe at the VA for somebody, you don't know if they have let somebody bum one of their cigarettes, or they've bummed cigarettes from somebody else. So that you know, the number of butts that, you know, the cigarettes that you've given them may be marked with little red dots, may be an overestimate or an underestimate of the number of cigarettes they've smoked for the day. Physical traces, we're not going to, essentially they're the same as behavior products. We're not going to talk about them that much, but they have to do with erosion, the wear and tear on things such as rugs or paths, you know, in grass, you know, so that's a behavior product, the wear and tear on grass so that it leaves a path. Number of broken windows is a measure of vandalism, dust on pictures, those kind of things. Simple observations is different than direct observation in that the observer plays an unobserved role. In other words, the person being observed doesn't know they're being observed. So that is a simple observation. These observations are made in schools or inpatient facilities where those observed are not aware of being observed. They, just by virtue of being in a location where they just blend in with other people, they don't know they're being observed, or you might have it set up more as a research situation where somebody's behind a two-way glass mirror. Okay. Chapter 10, I think I'm going to, since I didn't take long, I think I'm just going to keep rolling and put chapters 9 and 10 in the same file. Selecting a measure, and again this contains a lot of duplicate information from the last from chapters that talked about behavioral observations, independent rating scales, standardized scales, logs, and then the last one, unobtrusive measures. And on page 251, if you want to just put things into context, it gives you a summary of all the available measurement methods, and that's a good summary table to look at, and gives you some of the characteristics of the measure. I think let me take a, yeah, it talks about the measure and the situations where they may best be used. So take a look at that. Let's talk about the characteristics of the measure. Whenever you're selecting a measure, these are types of things you want to consider, and we've talked about most of these: reliability, validity, sensitivity to change, whether it's reactive or not, how direct it is in terms of what you're trying to measure, how direct that measure is. You know, if you're trying to change somebody's behavior, certainly behavioral observation is the most direct method. Ease of use, you want to consider accessibility, and also, of course, relevance to intervention planning. And we'll talk about that in terms of characteristics of the practice approach in a couple slides. Characteristics of the target. As I just mentioned, you want to measure the most direct representation of the outcome you hope to obtain. So if you're talking about behavior, then behavioral observation. If you're talking about changing somebody's thoughts, then you know, behavioral observation. Or sometimes there's some good standardized scales out there that, you know, will give you insight into people's thinking. So, or logs. Logs are another good direct representation sometimes of behavior and contextualizing behavior. Characteristics of the practice approach. You want to consider the theoretical approach. For example, for cognitive behavioral therapy, that may be a situation where you want to count negative thinking or count positive thinking. So you would use some types of behavior observations. If you were more psychodynamic in nature, maybe some standardized scales that talked about some attachment constructs, such as there's a standardized scale called the Parenting Bonding Inventory that might be appropriate. In terms of also practice, there are some interventions that have different components. One I can think of is like AA, it has 12 steps, and so you would want to match up, maybe possible to match up some of the different measures, to the different steps. Again, going back to what I said a long time ago, single system design is very dynamic. You could change the measures throughout your intervention where it makes sense. And finally, practitioner comfort. We've talked about presenting measures with confidence, and you also want to be comfortable with the measures that you use and how well they fit with the practice approach. And your experience with the measures. If you have a lot of confidence in a particular measure, then you're most likely going to use that because you have comfort with that. Characteristics of the client and other sources. Certainly you want to consider their willingness to cooperate, something they will do that doesn't overburden them, that they've bought into, that they believe is relevant to their intervention training. I want to, on your midterm, I want to ask, just because you give a client some measures to fill out doesn't mean they're going to fill it out. So there'll probably be a question on there is what strategies are you going to use in encouraging your client to fill it out. So that's just sort of a heads up. Think about that. And then finally, consider the ability to cooperate. Of course, some children are less able to fill out certain measures. They can certainly be, however, modified to fit children. Also, they may have people are mentally challenged. You want to consider that, and also finally consider whether the client allows relevant others to cooperate. It's not just whether the relevant others are willing and able to cooperate, but whether the client wants them to cooperate. It's always a good idea. I encourage you to include multiple measures and sources in a measurement package. That's what you'll be doing for your final paper. And we do that because changes are often multi-dimensional. Behaviors and feelings have different dimensions. For example, depression is multidimensional. Different measures sometimes do not correlate, and different sources sometimes do not agree. And in a way, that's an advantage. It's sort of the analogy of the elephant. You're getting a different part of the picture. A child's behavior may be different at home or school or in a therapeutic setting. So sometimes that difference is good. It comes. It's also problemsome when you're trying to decide what's valid data and what's not valid data. But it is sometimes often useful in getting the whole picture. So including multiple measures is very important. Guidelines in using multiple measures. Don't duplicate measures. There's no use to using 2 standardized scales for depression. It's just a duplication of effort that's not needed. That's a waste of time. You want to include at least 1 direct measure, so 1 behavioral observation. If you're looking at somebody's behavior, you want to try to include a behavioral observation measure. You want to use the most direct measures as possible. So you want to think about what you're measuring and what you're trying to change. You know, whether it be somebody's feelings or thoughts or behaviors, and try to come up with the best thing to measure that behavior, feeling, or thought. And then give serious consideration to the observation of overt behavior by relevant others, and also self-monitoring. That gets back to, that, directness. And I think the book says a lot about that as well. Other guidelines, you want to use more rather than less specific measures for client, target, and situation. You want, if you have a measure, you want it to be as specific as possible. For example, if your client has social anxiety, then you don't want to just use a generalized anxiety scale. You want to try to find anxiety that measures social anxiety. And that's where independent rating scales come in. If you can't find a standardized scale that covers your client's specific situation, then the independent rating scales are there to, you can design those to tailor those to the client. And the same thing with logs. Those can be easily tailored to the client. Consider the use of non-reactive measures when possible. We went over those earlier. Don't overburden any one person. That's for a couple different reasons. You don't want to overburden, but then you want also information from multiple sources. Focus measurement resources on primary target. Our clients come in with multiple problems, and in your latest paper in the section 2, I asked you to list those and then prioritize those and select the ones that you want for initial intervention, simply because it's impossible to measure everything. And so you want to focus on those areas that you initially want to intervene on, and focus your measurement resources on those, because your resources are limited. And potential problems in using multiple measures and sources is that your resources are limited. And the book suggests, try to find increased resources, but today that's hard to do with budgets being squeezed. We're asking more and more to do more with less. Another potential problem in using multiple measures and sources is that you find inconsistent results. And during data analysis, we'll talk more about this, but you're going to try to find some way to weigh the results for some targets and from some sources more heavily than from others. And you know, after you collect data for weeks, you should have a feeling of which measures and which sources are better, are more reliable, are more valid. So that's something that's probably going to come up in every case, you know, except maybe in the textbook, you know, where everything is neat and clean and everything, but in real life things aren't neat and clean. So that's the end of chapter 10, and I'm glad we got that done in one recording. So that's it.